I am so excited to be here and to talk about two of my absolute favorite topics, language and behavior. As I have advanced or progressed through my studies and my teaching and research, I have become really interested in thinking about how do we support children to acquire the skills that will help them learn and succeed. So thinking about what we talk about as academic enablers or approaches to learning, or some of you may have heard of non-cognitive skills, really thinking about the skills children need to be successful both in school and beyond school. From that, I have really been engaged in research thinking about how learning differences, especially language learning or language-based learning differences, impact children's abilities and opportunities to acquire these necessary skills that help them engage in academic learning. So tonight, we're going to explore this relationship between language and behavior and think about what some of the implications are about this relationship for school success, for being successful in community settings, and for life at home. If you have any questions, please feel free to stop as I go. We'll also have time at the end for a question and answer session, but if you have a question or need clarification, please just raise your hand because I'm happy to answer as we go. Also, there'll be some times in our conversation tonight where I'd love to hear from you about the behaviors that you've observed at home or in classrooms or in community settings, or some of your thoughts about this relationship between language and behavior. So when I have those questions, I'll be sure to make sure you know that they're not rhetorical and I am asking you, but I definitely would really enjoy engaging in a dialogue and discussion with you this evening, and not me just talking at you for an hour and a half. So with that said, let's think a little bit about language and behavior. At first, it might seem like a very obvious relationship. We know that really young children who aren't quite up to speed with being able to communicate their wants or feelings or needs might engage in behaviors such as hitting or throwing or taking a toy, and we say, well, that's because we're still working on teaching them how to request or to say what they want. But it's really a very complex relationship between language and behavior, and what we're going to talk about tonight is that it's a bidirectional relationship. Language affects behavior, and behavior affects language. In a review of the research literature in 2002, some researchers went through several hundred studies related to children with emotional and behavior disorders, and they found that 71% of children with identified emotional or behavioral disorders had an underlying language impairment. And because these behaviors, especially the externalizing or challenging behaviors, are so visible and challenging, often these underlying language difficulties go unaddressed. The other side is that children who have behavior problems, language scores are lower over time, and then children whose have difficulty with their language, their problem behaviors increase over time. So really trying to understand this relationship is what we're going to talk about tonight. So it's an obvious relationship, but a complex relationship. We know the relationship exists. It has been documented in the research literature. Not only do we know it exists, we can quantify the strength of this relationship statistically, and we can document that the relationship persists over time. But what we don't really know is why it develops or how it develops. And so as we're trying to gain better understanding about the nuances of this relationship and why it develops, there are some strategies that we have been researching in the intervention literature and educational literature that we know work to address some of these challenges. So we're going to end tonight with talking a little bit about what can you do? What can you do at home? What can you do at school? What are some tips for success? But before we get there, I want to make sure we're all on the same page as we talk about these terms, language and behavior. So first, what is language? Language is not speech, it's not communication. So we're not talking about how we produce sounds or to what degree you can understand the intelligibility and articulation of a child. We're not talking about general communication where our message is conveyed between two people and they understand it as a global communication. We're talking about a rule-governed system of arbitrary symbols. This is really important when we think about what it takes to acquire and use language successfully. So language is defined as a system of symbols, which can be words or images or gestures, that give meaning to speech and communication. So to successfully acquire and use language, you have to learn what these rules are. Generally, we divide language into receptive language and expressive language. Receptive language is the ability to understand these language symbols, and that can be through hearing them or seeing them. Expressive language is using these systems to convey a message to someone else. Children who have difficulties in acquiring language may have trouble with their receptive language or their expressive language or both. So working with a child who has difficulties with language, one of the first questions you should be thinking about is whether the difficulties are in understanding language or successfully using language or both. And when I talk about expressive language, I'm not talking about how they're talking to you. I'm talking about what they're actually saying. So children who have difficulties with receptive language are going to have difficulty understanding and decoding what they're hearing and what they're reading or seeing. And children who have expressive language difficulties are going to have trouble talking and expressing their thoughts and feelings through verbal or written communication. And children who have difficulties in both domains are going to have difficulty understanding and using language successfully. So right away, you can start thinking about how that might influence their behavior. If they have trouble understanding you or talking to you, what might they do? Language is fabulously complex. To successfully use and acquire language, we have many features of language that we have to learn and understand, and other skills that are intertwined with our language acquisition and use. So first we need to understand about sounds and the rules that govern sounds and how we put sounds together. That's phonology. Then when we understand about sounds, we have to understand about words and what are the system of rules that govern words. So when you change a tense or when you add a prefix or a suffix or make something plural, and then what are the rules for combining words together? So that's morphology and syntax. And we often talk about grammar. That's as a feature of language. And then based on that, we also have to have words to put into those sentences. So we have to have concepts and words that convey our meaning and our concept. And that's vocabulary or semantics. Once we have that, we have to decide the functional and socially appropriate use of these words and sentences, and that's pragmatics. While all of that is going on, you also need to consider hearing and understanding in terms of learning language, and the ability to communicate. So motor skills and communicating either through your oral motor skills by speaking or an alternate mode of communication like a speech-generating device or PECS or sign language, which would all still be considered expressive language. And then interwoven through all of that are our cognition, our cognitive skills and our executive functioning skills. So thinking about skills like attention and problem solving and processing and memory and organization and planning, that's going to impact our language acquisition and use as well. So when we talk about language, we're really thinking about all of these pieces. It's a lot to learn. But a simpler way, perhaps, of thinking about language is dividing it into its form, its content, and its use. So in our form, those are the rules for how our language in putting together sounds and words and putting words together. Then we have our content, which is our semantics, which is our vocabulary. So what do we mean? What are we trying to say? And then the use, which are the pragmatics. So what happens when there's a breakdown in any of these language features of development? Anything can be impacted when there's a deficit in language or difference in language development. And that manifests by perhaps students using improper words, so using the wrong word to convey their meaning. They may have trouble expressing their ideas, their thoughts, their feelings, their reactions. They may have incorrect grammatical patterns in both their written and spoken language. They might have a limited or reduced vocabulary. They might have a lot of trouble following directions. Then we add behavior to the mix. What is behavior? Generally and broadly speaking, behavior is anything you do. But we're going to narrow in on that tonight. Tonight we're mostly going to talk about pro-social behaviors and behaviors that we want children to learn and to do. And then we're also going to talk about challenging behaviors. And challenging behaviors are behaviors that are interfering with the opportunities to have successful interactions with others and to learn. In the psychology and assessment literature, they have defined some of these challenging behaviors as quote-unquote problem behavior. And then problem behavior is then separated into internalizing behavior and externalizing behavior. So if any of you have ever filled out a rating scale about a child's behavior, the way that rating scale was designed may have been, depending on which one you filled out, designed to capture internalizing behavior, externalizing behavior, and total behavior. Internalizing behavior refers to any of your internal behaviors, and the common behaviors under this construct are anxiety, withdrawal, depression. Externalizing behaviors are the behaviors that we can see and we can observe and measure. And these are the behaviors that children engage in externally to their world. Common externalizing behaviors are hyperactivity, aggression, bullying, disruption, noncompliance, property destruction, etc. And just as a reminder, I want you to think about behaviors, especially these externalizing behaviors, often mask a child's language difficulties. Because as a parent or the therapist or the teacher, you are so focused on trying to either de-escalate a behavior or prevent a behavior that it's really hard to take a step back and think about what are the underlying mechanisms that are contributing to why this child is engaging in this behavior. So that's my challenge for you tonight. Tonight I want you to think about why a child is engaging in a behavior he or she is engaging in. And if he or she has any underlying language learning difficulties, how is that also contributing to this, these behavioral challenges? So when I'm not talking about the rating scale assessment that uses the term problem behaviors, I'm going to be using the term challenging behaviors. And in the early childhood and early childhood special education literature, which is my background, so this is really a focus on birth to third grade, we conceptualize and define challenging behaviors as any behavior that interferes with a child's ability and opportunities to engage in positive relationships, to form friendships, to play with others, and to learn expected skills. So we're not talking about the one time that Johnny had a temper tantrum or a meltdown. I bet all of us in this room have had a temper tantrum or a meltdown at some point in our lives. We're not talking about the one time that a sister hit her brother. We're talking about the times where children are repeatedly and frequently engaging in these behaviors. And because of that, they are having trouble forming friendships, engaging in positive social and successful social interactions, and learning. So as you think through your experiences, what are some examples of challenging behaviors that you've witnessed for pre-K to third grade? Theft. What else?
Excessive grumpiness and banging into people and then saying, hey, when really nothing really happened.
Yes. So
So
some
blame, kind of.
vocal outburst a little bit, not some body awareness and physical contact with others.
Disruption,
Throwing toys.
Impulsivity.
Impulsivity. So how might that manifest itself?
Rushing to be at the front of a line or turning off a light on and off in a classroom.
Yes, the flicking the lights, rushing to be at the front, raising your hand right away when the teacher hasn't even finished asking the question.
lack of flexibility, like always wanting your own way, play your game.
So it's some rigidity and lack of flexibility, or being a little maybe unwilling to try to transition to a different activity or try something new. So behaviors that we interpret as potentially being frustrated. She's slamming doors, she is stomping her feet, she's saying things.
I told you, and yet what she said wasn't intelligent.
Right. Right, it wasn't conveying the meaning she thought she was conveying, right? So she was having trouble trying to convey her message, and so she had some other behavior she was engaging in at the same time. Anything else?
Frequent interruptions out of turn.
Yes, frequent interruptions, talking out of turn.
Difficulty with taking the turn or turn taking.
Turn taking. So I think you've all discussed several behaviors that when a child engages in them repeatedly, they would affect their ability to make friendships and their opportunities to make friendships and to have positive relationships with adults and peers. It would impact their play, and it would interfere or compete with some of the academic skills and other skills that they're trying to learn at school and at home. And what I really liked about most of the behaviors that you mentioned are that they could happen anywhere. They can happen in the aisle at the grocery store. They can happen at the park. They can happen at home. They can happen at a friend's house. They can happen at school. So these behaviors are not limited to the classroom, and they're not limited to a certain age. As we talk more about challenging behaviors tonight, I want you to think about 3 principles that are going to lay the foundation for conceptualizing behavior. The first is that behavior is communication. Every single one of those behaviors could be telling you something, and you need to think about what it's telling you. The second is that all behavior is maintained by consequences. And when I say consequences, I do not mean discipline or punishment. Consequence means the response to the behavior. What happens immediately following that behavior? Whatever you do, or whatever the friend does, or whatever the sibling does in response to that behavior is going to predict how likely that child's going to engage in that behavior again. And then number 3, behavior is context specific. So the setting events, what's going on in the child's life, where the child is, what the demands are that are placed on the child, and what happens right before they engage in that behavior, which we call the antecedent, is all linked to the child actually engaging in that behavior. So when we're in the midst of dealing with challenging behaviors, trying to help someone who was hit by a toy that was thrown, or someone who's upset that their toy was taken away, or we're trying to encourage the student who is talking out of turn to focus on his or her work, we often are just paying attention to that one instance of the behavior. But what I'm going to argue and propose to you tonight is that one instance is not random. When the child is engaging in challenging behaviors repeatedly, they are predictable. They're not random. That's because they're telling you something. They tend to occur predictably in certain situations. So in certain circumstances or contexts, with a specific antecedent or a consequence, that behavior is likely to occur. So now I have a question for you. Just with that brief 15, 20-minute introduction, given what we know about the forms, functions, and use of language and the principles of behavior, why might young children with language-based learning differences engage in higher rates of challenging behaviors compared to their peers who do not have language-based learning differences? Because it works. The behavior works.
Because they're struggling to communicate in a way that we understand and share those ideas back and forth. There's not a common language between
Exactly.
the child with the difficulties and the audience that they're trying to reach.
Very well said. There's not a common language. The child is having trouble through our language trying to communicate his or her intent, and so they're finding a different way to communicate.
Because they can be easier. Without pragmatics, they don't worry about what's socially appropriate.
So because they can be easier and without pragmatics, they don't worry about what is socially appropriate. It is linked to also because it works. So it's efficient and it works. They get their demand or need met when they engage in that behavior. So this now is a challenge to you to start thinking about, what do you do? If this is working and this is a behavior you clearly don't want children engaged in. So we've been focusing on language and behavior, and we're going to continue to focus on this relationship between language and behavior. But as you've all insinuated, language and behavior doesn't exist in a vacuum. There are other features to think about when we're connecting language and behavior. Thinking about underlying child characteristics and the environment are two of those factors. So underlying child characteristics include personality, temperament, whether the child has an underlying primary disability. Environment can include the opportunities to learn, the stressors that are in place, what's consistent in the environment. So for the next little bit, we're really going to talk about this relationship, but I want you to remember it's part of a much more complex connection of child characteristics, language, and behavior. And as you already know, we could make many more boxes coming out of these language and behavior figures as well. But right now, I want to talk about what is the strength of this relationship and does it persist over time. I'm going to do that by talking to you about a couple of different research studies. And the first one is to look at the strength of the relationship between language and behavior. So some colleagues of mine and I were really interested in, okay, there are all these studies out there, but how do we put that information all together in one document to really understand what this relationship is? So we had two questions. The first question we had was, do children with diagnosed language delays have more problem behaviors than children with typical language skills? And then the second question was, do children with language delays have fewer social skills than children with typical language skills? What's your hypothesis? Yes to both?
Yeah.
Yes. So you're right. The answer is yes. But how different is what we really wanted to know. So in thinking about how different, we decided to complete what we call a meta-analysis. And meta-analytic techniques allow us to look at the results from a lot of studies and pull it together to have statistical interpretation of the findings across all studies. So that's what we did. And we included studies that were written in English that only included children up to 8 years old. All studies had to include children with and without a language impairment or a language disability, and they had to look at both problem behaviors and social skills. So when we did all that, you're right. The answers were yes. Young children with identified language delays before 8 years old had more challenging behaviors than children with typical language skills. How big was this difference? It was statistically significantly different between children with and without language impairment. These numbers are effect size numbers. They can also be thought of as similar to standard deviations. So for internalizing behaviors, if you go back and think about that flow chart where we broke behavior into internalizing and externalizing, for internalizing behaviors, there was almost between 1/2 and 1 standard deviation difference on measures of internalizing behavior between children with and without language impairments. In thinking about externalizing behaviors or problem behaviors, you had about a 0.4 standard deviation difference between children with and without language impairments on their externalizing behavior and problem behavior assessments. That's a pretty big difference. But it got even bigger when we looked at social skills. So social skills like cooperation, communication, assertion, responsibility, self-control, empathy, those behaviors, which were grouped as social skills, we had almost a full standard deviation difference between children with and without language impairment on measures of social skills. It was a 0.83 effect size. So what does that mean? We had a few recommendations in really thinking about these differences. One is that language screening and language assessment should also include screening and assessment of social skills and challenging behaviors simultaneously. So if we have a concern about a child's language and we're doing initial assessment, we should also be assessing their social skills and their problem behaviors so that we have a complete picture of where they are. Early intervention instruction for young children's language development should also address social and behavioral functioning. They're not separate silos. They're working together. And practitioners who work with young children with language delays also should continue to monitor their behavior and social development. So we know that this relationship exists. The next question is, does it continue over time? So in this study, we looked at problem behaviors and language skills of children with language impairment and without language impairment at the end of preschool, at the end of kindergarten, and at the end of first grade. This is a unique sample because it's a Head Start sample, so it's a majority, the majority of the population was African American. It was 55% male, and all of the children came from low-income backgrounds. We asked 2 questions. One, what was the relationship between language and problem behaviors at the end of pre-K, at the end of kindergarten, and at the end of first grade? So looking at each year separately. But then we also asked the question of, did problem behaviors and language skills in pre-K predict what the language skills and problem behaviors would be in kindergarten? And did they predict what the language skills and problem behaviors would be in first grade? So we had about 400 students, and about 12% of them had a diagnosed language impairment. So first we were looking at the incidence of problem behaviors at each time point. And here we were defining problem behaviors as clinical or subclinical levels of problem behavior as measured on assessments of problem behavior. So it was based on scores. So the blue columns are children who had typical language skills and were not identified as having a language impairment. The red columns are children who had language impairments. And so what you can see is that the percentage of children with clinical or subclinical levels of problem behavior at every time point. And we found that in kindergarten, children with language impairment were 3 times more likely to have problem behavior than children who did not have a language impairment, and that in first grade, children with language impairment were 2 times more likely to exhibit problem behaviors. Another way to look at it was through this graph. So the red bars are the percentage of children in the sample who had internalizing behaviors at clinical levels. The yellow bars are the percentage of the sample who had externalizing behaviors at clinical levels. The bluish-grayish bars are total problem behaviors. And then these brown bars are the percentage of students who had an identified language impairment. So this is at the end of pre-K, the end of kindergarten, at the end of first grade. What do you notice about the brown bars, the percentage of children with language impairment? Stays the same. What do you notice about externalizing behaviors?
There's a big jump between pre-K and K.
There's a big jump between the end of pre-K and K in the percentage of children who have clinical levels of externalizing behavior and clinical levels of total problem behavior. So while the percentage of students who had a diagnosed language impairment stayed stable, the percentage of children who had language or problem behaviors increased. So it more than doubled from the end of pre-K to the end of kindergarten and continued to increase at the end of first grade. What does that mean? What are possible explanations for this change?
The expectations are higher.
Yes, the expectations are different, right? Navigating a pre-K classroom is different than in a pre-K Head Start classroom, may be very different than a public kindergarten classroom.
These kids are starting to realize that they are different and are communicating differently than their peers, and so they start to act out.
They might be acting out because they're more aware of some of their differences. What else? So not only is the learning environment different and the expectations are different, the language demand is different. Think about the language demands that are placed on children in pre-K compared to first grade. Your instruction is different, the demands are different, the language development, so when we think about morphology and grammar, and how you go from using a few words to having much more complex sentence structure, how that changes as you get older. There also could be rater differences. So remember that these problem behaviors are identified by teachers. So your own internal values about how you expect a kindergarten or first grader to behave compared to a preschooler could also influence these results. We don't know exactly why it doubles here and continues to increase. These are all possibilities for why we see this jump when the percentage of children with language impairment stays the same. So she's mentioning that critical third grade year where people start to really identify if a child may be falling behind, or the wait and see approach, you're no longer waiting. You feel that it's time to act. It's also that time where we say you're switching from learning to read to reading to learn. So comprehension becomes another big factor in language with expectations in third grade. I bet we would see another jump in third grade if we had those data. But definitely thinking about how demands and expectations change over time, maybe influencing some of the data that we are collecting related to the incidence of problem behaviors. This is also another way to look at these differences that we saw over time. This is comparing children with and without language impairment. So each symbol on this graph actually represents the difference between children with and without language impairment. So at the end of pre-K, there were significant differences on internalizing, externalizing, and total problem behavior for children with and without language impairment at about a 0.3 standard deviation. But over time, the differences in total problem behavior between children with and without a language impairment went to about a half of a standard deviation difference. But the difference in internalizing behavior decreased and became non-significant. Why might that have been? I don't think in actuality it decreased. Why do our numbers say it decreased?
They got better at hiding it.
They might have gotten better at hiding it.
They're not focusing on the.
Oh, I'm pointing at you, sorry.
They're not focusing on the kids who are being quiet and sitting there still. They're focusing on the kids with external behavior.
It's very hard to measure internalizing behaviors. We can see externalizing behaviors. So I think these numbers actually really represent a measurement and an assessment problem and not really a decrease in the behaviors. But that is something for us to think about too, that the focus of the talk tonight really is about externalizing behaviors. But I want you to still remember that the internalizing behaviors are really important. And when I looked at the agenda for the lecture series here, there are many wonderful sessions related to anxiety. So I would really, if you didn't have a chance to come, I would encourage you to look at the videos or to come to future sessions, because anxiety and stress are all related to internalizing behaviors, and we're not going to talk about that tonight, but it's still very important. So up to this point, we've talked, can you hold on one second? Up to this point, we have talked about the concurrent, looking at language and behavior at each time point. The next question we wanted to ask was, does language predict problem behavior later? And does problem behavior predict language later? And the answer was yes. So this is a bidirectional relationship. Total problem behavior at the end of pre-K and in kindergarten predicted first grade language scores. Children with persistent problem behaviors at the clinical level were 5 times more likely to have language delays in first grade. Looking the other way, overall language skills at the end of pre-K and kindergarten predicted total problem behaviors in first grade. Children with persistent language delays were almost 3 times more likely to have problem behaviors at the clinical level in first grade. So now this relationship between language and behavior, which might have been obvious at the beginning, is starting to feel a little more complex. Did you have a question? So you're bringing up really important question about the relationship between students who have ADHD and students who also have underlying language-based learning difficulties, and how do you separate out some of their behaviors which might be a manifestation of ADHD versus their behaviors that may be more a manifestation of a language-based learning disability, and then the next step of, in these data, where were the kids with ADHD? And so very important points. The first is it's really hard to tease it out. There are many children who have ADHD so have a co-occurring or a comorbid language-based learning difficulty, specific learning disability, specific language impairment, in addition to having ADHD. And it's very challenging to know what is coming from where, but instead I think we need to think about how we can support. So regardless of whether it's a manifestation of language or a manifestation of ADHD, what do you need to do to meet the needs of the child? As far as the data are concerned, we did not separate that out. So if they had ADHD and a language-based learning disability, they're coming up as a clinical externalizing and clinical total problem behavior, and we could probably pull out from the assessment data what fell as ADHD and what fell as maybe another clinical diagnosis, but we lumped them together. So they're in these, those students are in these data. Any other questions? Okay, so the takeaway message from this study was that children with language delays have higher rates of problem behaviors. Children with language delays were 3 times more likely to have problem behaviors in kindergarten than children without language delays. And children with language delays were 2 times more likely to have problem behaviors in first grade than children without language delays. Language skills predict problem behavior over time, and problem behavior predicts language scores over time. So more evidence suggesting we need to consider both language and behavior in our assessments and instructional planning. So we're going to now take a step back from the research and now think about our practice. So thinking now here about the connections between language and behavior, underlying child characteristics, and the environment, and our 3 principles that we talked about at the beginning. Every behavior is telling us something. What we do following the behavior is what maintains the behavior, and behaviors are context-specific and predictable. The questions we're going to talk about now are, what do we do when a child with a language-based disability engages in challenging behaviors? How might we as teachers, therapists, and parents prevent challenging behaviors and promote desired behaviors? So primary focus moving forward is about how to prevent, teach, and reinforce. So less of a reactive approach and more of a proactive approach. But if we're going to take this proactive lens and framework, we need to think about what it is we're going to teach. So in early education, these are the research has noted these skills are what are critical for success in school and success after school. Having confidence, being able to develop good relationships with peers and adults, being able to concentrate and persist on challenging tasks, being able to effectively communicate your emotions, being able to listen to instructions and be attentive, and to effectively and efficiently solve problems. Do you see language in any of these skills? All of them, right? So behaviors, communication. When children engage in challenging behaviors, what are they telling us? When a child is flicking the lights, every single time, actually I had a child who was flicking the lights every time it was time to leave the cafeteria. He would run over and just flick the lights and flick the lights and flick the lights. Or the child who during circle time or large group work time is running around the classroom and will not sit down. Or the child who during instruction or seat work stands on the desk and starts yelling something. What are they telling us? It might be attention, that's one thing. It might be, I can't and don't want to do this. Okay? Generally, many of the behaviors you see are either to get access to attention or to escape attention, or to get access to an activity or toy or material, or to get out of it. And one of the first things I think one of the first conclusions we jump to is it's an attention-seeking behavior. What's the problem with that?
You're not looking at the root.
Right, so if it's escape and not attention, and so let's say my kid who stands on the desk during large group and starts yelling things or during seat work, and I assume he just wants attention. And so I'm not going to give him attention because I do not want him standing on this desk. I'm going to send him to the principal's office. What happens if that behavior is actually escape maintained? He won. Every time he engages in that behavior, I send him out of the room. He doesn't have to do his seat work. He doesn't have to be part of the class. The student who's running around in circles in the classroom because he or she doesn't want to do the activity and I let him do that and I ignore it because he's just doing that for attention. He gets what he wants. I had a runner who would elope out of the classroom but would run down to the end of the hall. The teacher would go booking it after the student. And he'd be at the end of the hall, lying on his back, laughing and like rolling because that teacher was running as fast as she can after him. It worked every single time. So understanding what a behavior is telling you should help you figure out what you should do in response. Because if it's an attention-maintained behavior, you don't want to provide attention for that behavior. If it's to get out of something, you don't want them to get out of it. And we want to talk about what we should do instead.
I struggle a bit with the word want. A lot of this is I'm not able to. It's not that the child doesn't want to attend to the task or the child doesn't want to complete the assignment. It's the child isn't able to.
It's both. I've seen both. So there are actually, it's three things. There's motivation and there's skill. So often in the behavioral literature we talk about it as an acquisition deficit or a performance deficit. So an acquisition deficit is I don't have the skill set to successfully complete whatever the demand is, and I need to be taught how to do it. Or the task needs to be modified. A performance deficit is I do have that skill set, but I either can't do it in this context, I haven't generalized it, or I am not motivated to do it in this context, which is a reinforcement problem and a problem with how we've designed our activity. So you're right, it's not as simple as want, but the purpose is to really think about what is maintaining the behavior. So it could be, I need attention, I don't want this attention, I want to engage in activity, or I'm interested in gaining access to something, I don't want this, I want to escape it. I want that toy, I don't want that toy. I need this sensory input, this sensory input is aversive, and I need an escape. So we can really make a matrix related to attention, activity, or tangible or material, or sensory, and then divide it as trying to get access to it or trying to escape from it. So as we already talked about tonight, children engage in challenging behaviors because they work for them. How we respond to them increases the likelihood that they're going to engage in that behavior again. I'm going to go a little bit more quickly as I just gaze at the clock, but if you have any questions, please stop me. So children may engage in challenging behaviors when expectations are unclear or inconsistent. Children may engage in challenging behaviors if the activities are too challenging or if they're too easy. Children may engage in challenging behaviors if they don't understand the instructions or the directions, the demand is too challenging, they do not have the skills to successfully complete the task, they are not motivated to engage in the desired behavior, they are being reinforced for engaging in the challenging behavior. Is this limited to the classroom? No. It can happen at home too. So the questions you want to ask yourself when a child is repeatedly engaging in a challenging behavior is, what is happening right before that behavior? What happens immediately before? What's the expectation? What did someone say or do? What happens right before? We call that the antecedent. What consequences maintaining the behavior? What happens right after? How are you responding? Or how is someone responding to the behavior? And then the third but very important question is, can we teach an alternate appropriate behavior that they could do instead, that meets that same function or need and is efficient? Because if it doesn't meet the need and it's not efficient, there's no reason to give up the challenging behavior. We've already pretty much answered this, but if behaviors are context-specific and maintained by consequences, can we prevent the occurrence of an undesired behavior? Yes. Whose behavior often has to change to prevent a child's behavior? The adult. You might have to make a change to the environment. You might have to make a change to the task or the demand. You might have to make a change in your response, or you might have to support other students or siblings in learning other ways to respond to a peer. I think what's really important as we think about this is that most behaviors do not require intensive interventions. Most behaviors can be promoted through positive and preventative approaches. And these are all approaches that I think are familiar to many of us, but because they seem so familiar, sometimes we lose track of them. Having clear and consistent expectations is critical. Establishing routines and following them is essential. We need to teach children what we want them to do. Social skills are really hard. And there's an expectation that children should come to school ready to learn and that they have these skills. But really, these skills need to be taught. So how are we going to teach them? When we teach them, we need to provide some sort of reinforcement for them when they engage in those behaviors, so they're likely to do it again. And when they engage in challenging behaviors, we want to understand why. So to think about teaching these critical skills, there is a framework, an evidence-based framework, which is the teach, show, do, practice, reinforce model. This is a really great model, especially for children who have language-based learning differences, because it does not solely rely on verbal instructions and communication. So as a teacher, as a parent, you want to think about truly teaching what you want the child to do. You model what you want the child to do. You provide an opportunity for the child to do it in that teaching context. You then embed opportunities for the child to do that as part of their routine, and when they do, you provide reinforcement and feedback. So it's a systematic approach, and this approach can be applied to many different kinds of skills. It's mostly been evaluated in the social skills research that the most effective social skills interventions and instructions were those that had these components. If one of these components was missing, it was not as effective. So we have to teach what we want, we have to show them how to do it, we have to provide opportunities for them to practice and reinforce the behaviors. So social skills, what kind of skills do we want to work on? We want to work on conversational turn-taking. We want to work on requesting. We want to work on play skills. With adults, we want to make sure that we build open communication, that as an adult we are warm, we're responsive, we nod our head and give verbal or nonverbal cues along with our verbal cues, and that our behavior and our words match. We do what we say we're going to do. We want to help children learn how to request help and be responsive to all of their communication initiations. Persistence on challenging tasks. So if you notice, these are the same critical skills that were a few slides back about what has been essential for school success. Persistence on challenging tasks. It should not be about the final product. We want to encourage effort and persistence. So really focusing on the process and not the outcome. So really thinking about how we can encourage and reinforce how hard a student or child is working, how hard a student or child is trying, so that they then want to continue to try. Communication, it's important to teach children how to describe how they're feeling. By you describing how you feel and mapping words, that helps them learn how to describe how they're feeling. You want to listen to, they need to learn how to listen and be to instructions and be attentive, which means your instructions need to be brief, broken down, and your time expectations for how long they have to attend need to be realistic. So you want to be right at their level or a tiny bit above it so that they can actually attend for that long. And if that's 30 seconds, it's 30 seconds, because then you're going to build from there. If it's 5 minutes, you work at 5 minutes and then you build from there. But you want to set up for them to be successful so that they don't automatically feel like there's no way they can do it. And problem solving, you need social opportunities to teach problem solving and conflict resolution in context. Thinking about communication as well, from a perspective of teaching, we want to build language by being responsive and effective communication partners. It's really hard as teachers when you have a classroom full of students to make sure that you're talking to and being responsive to every student in the classroom. But we ran an informal study where we had in preschool, where it was a very responsive teacher, said every time you talk to a student in your class during the day, go put a little game chip on top of their cubby. And at the end of the day, look at the distribution of your chips to see, do you have one child you're talking to all the time and one child you're not talking to at all? And it's sort of an interesting self-check to think about how responsive you are as an adult. You tend to be responsive where you feel there is a demand or what needs your attention, and sometimes that means other children aren't getting that and same level of responsiveness. So being responsive, respond to every communication intent. So for children who have expressive language difficulties, this is really important. So that effort, you need to respond, because otherwise it's not going to be worth that effort and it's a lot easier to engage in a behavior. Talk to every student in the classroom. Talk while you're engaged in routines. This helps build both communication and their language skills. Describe what you're doing as you do it so that they have the visual and the physical match to the words. Talk about what you see and hear. Pair verbal language with gestures or visuals to support their understanding. And describe how activities or behaviors make you feel so that they can help learn to identify and communicate their emotions. Use spoken language to respond to children's nonverbal communication. So if a child points or has another gesture, you map verbal language to it. And then for children who are using higher rates of nonverbal and lower rates of verbal, you can up the ante a little bit. And while we're all really good at anticipating what a student might want or what a child might want, really wait that extra second to see if they will actually ask you for it or tell you. Always tell children what you are going to do before you do it. This is really critical, especially if you're going to have any changes in your routines or your schedule or your expectations. And recast and expand what children say to continue to build that vocabulary. Despite all of this work and everything you are doing to have fabulous environments for children to be successful, there will still be some children who are engaging in significant challenging behaviors. At this point in time, you will want to get some help to really think about why the behavior is occurring. And so we talk about that by conducting functional behavioral assessments. These assessments should be conducted with help from behavior specialists and other specialists. But the purpose of an FBA is to really identify that function. So those functions that we sort of crudely broke into get access to or escape from attention, activity, and sensory, it's that approach to really think about what is the underlying function maintaining the behavior. And we need to collect data from multiple sources to help us make that hypothesis. We need to observe the child in the environment where the challenging behavior is occurring. We need to observe the child in the environments where the challenging behavior is not occurring. We want to talk to parents, we want to talk to teachers, potentially review school records depending on what the behavior is. All that information should go together to really hypothesize what the function of the behavior is, and then at that point, use that information for families, teachers, and specialists to work together to identify and design and implement behavioral strategies across settings to teach the skills that children need to learn and decrease opportunities and need for children to engage in challenging behaviors. And I really emphasize that word together because the collaboration and cross-contextual support is key. For any behavioral approach to be effective across contexts, we really need a team approach. The 4 key elements of an effective behavioral intervention plan are that they should change what happens right before the behavior. So you want to think about your antecedent modifications. What do you have to change? The environment, the demand, your prompt, so that the child may not engage in that behavior. What do you have to change about your response so that the child may not engage in that behavior? Not only do we want to get rid of the challenging behavior, we want to teach a replacement behavior. How are you going to teach that replacement behavior? And when they are engaging in behaviors, how are we going to support them and reinforce them when they're engaging in behaviors we want them to engage in? If a behavior intervention plan doesn't address all 4 of these features, it's going to be really hard to extinguish that challenging behavior because there are multiple pieces that are really maintaining why that challenging behavior is working so well for that child or student. Even the best behavior intervention plan doesn't work immediately. So this also is said with the reminder it is going to get worse before it gets better. 1 second. Children who engage in challenging behaviors have learned a system or routine that has been working for them, and you're going to change the rules on them. And they're going to say, well, it used to be when I did this, this happened. And now I'm doing it, and that's not happening anymore because you've changed the consequence. So they're going to keep doing it to see, well, is it going to happen again? Is it going to happen again? And it's not. So eventually then they'll stop that challenging behavior, but they're going to test it first. We call that an extinction burst. Okay, it's gonna get worse before it gets better, which means don't give up. It doesn't mean your plan's not working. It means that it might be really hard at first, especially as you're trying to teach the replacement or desired behavior, and you need that behavior to become just as efficient as what the challenging behavior used to be. So with that said, let's think a little bit about what you can do at home and what you can do at school. So parents, you are the best expert on your child. Use that expertise. Think about what your child likes and dislikes. Build off their strengths, build off their interests. At times that are really challenging, how can you incorporate what they like or what they're good at? Be mindful of when and where your child's triggers are. What are the difficult routines? What are the difficult times? When does this behavior occur? What could you do to try to prevent it? Can you pre-teach what's going to happen? Can you go through a role play ahead of time? Think about what those triggers are to be prepared. Consider the complexity of your language. I had a neuropsychologist that I worked with who said, you don't ever want to have that Charlie Brown effect where you're talking and the kid only hears wah, 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 right? Think about how complex your instructions or your directions or what you're saying is. Can you break it down into steps? Just like our expectations need to be at the child's level or a little bit above, the language we use needs to be at that child's level or a little bit above. Consider carefully what you're doing after the behavior. Ask yourself, is what I'm doing really maintaining the behavior? Model and practice what you want children to do, and find parent-friendly reinforcement systems. So we're talking about reinforcement, and just as consequence didn't mean discipline or punishment, reinforcement doesn't mean reward or prize. Reinforcement means something that you do that's going to increase the likelihood that the child will engage in that behavior again in the future. And what is reinforcing to each child is different. Praise is not reinforcing to all children. Stickers are not reinforcing to all children. Getting a special seat is not reinforcing to all children. Certain toys are not reinforcing to all children. So you have to first think about what might be reinforcing. Getting a break, working hard and not having to do a specific chore, getting to sit next to you on the couch or at the kitchen table, thinking about, for some stickers are something that works, but reinforcement has to happen immediately following the behavior you want them to do, which means whatever you pick as a reinforcer needs to be something you can access anywhere at first, because you have to provide it every time. As they start to acquire the behavior, you're going to fade how often you reinforce it. But at the beginning, you have to reinforce it every time. So if praise is reinforcing, then that is a really cheap, quick, efficient reinforcer. But it only works if it's reinforcing. So think about what works for you that is also going to work for your child. Teachers, use your expertise about the classroom. Set up a few classroom rules and expectations. It's really great if the students can help you identify these rules and expectations at the beginning of the year. Only start with a few, add more over time. Prepare students for transitions. This does not just apply to pre-K and kindergarten. We all need transition warnings. 5 minutes left, 1 minute left, a reminder of what happens next. I still have reminders in my phone to help me remember about what's coming next. I have warnings on my phone. They benefit students as well. Think about options in your classroom for de-escalating a behavior if a student begins to engage in a behavior. What can you do that isn't inadvertently reinforcing the behavior? If it is not an attention-seeking behavior, you can provide a reminder of what the expectation is. Ahead of time, you still want to remind, before there's a behavior, what the expectations are, what you want the child to do. Be concise when you're talking. Provide choices. Often some of these behaviors are because the demands are so high. Think about how you can reduce the demand. Think about how you can provide opportunities for temporary escapes that are more functional and feasible than the child engaging in the challenging behaviors. Model and practice what you want the children to do. Role playing is really effective, and catch kids being good. They need both contingent and non-contingent reinforcement. So contingent reinforcement means you get the reinforcer contingent upon doing what I want you to do. When we're teaching a new behavior, you need contingent reinforcement every time. You also need general reinforcement for other things where they're meeting expectations. It's not your targeted replacement behavior, but for other behaviors that are desired, you want to reinforce those as well, and not reinforce any of the challenging behaviors. Remember, reinforcers don't have to be tangibles or edibles. It doesn't have to be food, it doesn't have to be a toy, it doesn't have to be a prize, but it does have to be reinforcing to the child. There are 2 websites at the end here that I strongly encourage you to look up if you haven't looked them up yet. One is the IRIS Center, and the other is CEFL, the Center on the Social and Emotional Foundations of Early Learning. Both of these sites provide resources for therapists, specialists, parents, teachers. They provide video vignettes, they provide learning case study modules, they provide research what works briefs that are research syntheses that are in 2 pages with practical strategies and provide additional references. They are all free to the public, and it takes a little bit of time to figure out how the sites are organized and what's there, but there's a lot of useful information related to behavior and classroom management, something we have not talked about tonight, but dual language learners who have language-based learning disabilities, learning strategies, differentiated instruction, thinking about the impact of language differences on behavior, helping children learn to manage their own behavior, which is what we want to encourage as children get older, and what are children trying to tell us, more specific examples about really conducting a functional behavioral assessment. So with that, I'm going to wrap up from my slides, and we have about 10 minutes where I can answer. I saw a lot of hands that I kind of was motioning 1 more minute. I'd be happy to take your specific questions. Do you still have one?
How do you reinforce or de-reinforce if you see your child doing it with the friends?
So one good thing is, like, before that play date or time is to talk up, like, practice together some play skills, and even kind of have a scenario where if your friend does this, what are some things you can do? And really talk about it, model, role play before. In the moment, you need to be, it's hard with the friend there. If you can intervene, that's great. If you can't, afterwards you can also talk about it and go back and role play and talk about other strategies. When the friend is there, you still want to at least provide some feedback for the things that you like that you're observing. So when there are turn taking or sharing, you can comment on that and put some language to their actions so they recognize that you value those behaviors, and that and they'll also get that feedback from their friend, probably, who is enjoying engaging with them, as opposed to the friend who then gets upset and doesn't want to play anymore, which is a natural consequence of those behaviors. So that's a great question. So the question is related to transition warnings or instructions and a strategy that you can use one-on-one at home versus that consistency and cross-contextual support. And that's where it becomes, there are 2 things. One, are the behaviors you're observing at home also happening at school? If they're not happening at school and they're only happening at home, you should communicate with the teacher about what you're doing at home, but you can really focus your strategies on home only. If they're happening across contexts in similar ways, this becomes a time where it's really important to have that teacher-parent communication. It has to be frequent communication. There needs to be a plan, and I think having a discussion about what works at home and how could that be applied at school or modified in some way at school, or can it be modified in some way at school, is a really important conversation. This cross-contextual communication and support across context is huge. When there are those differences, that's when you have a really hard time extinguishing the challenging behavior. It may be that then over time it's okay at home, but it's not okay at school. And you have to think about some strategies that would work for the teacher in the classroom in the school. As far as instructions are concerned, you can break, even if they come home as a large set of directions, you can break them down in addition to the when then you want to have a conversation with the teacher about whether she can break down the instructions and directions as well into smaller steps. So the question is about identifying the function or what is triggering or prompting the behavior. So this is where you want to take a step back and look at the full context. So not only what's triggering it, but what the responses are. If you've heard of ABC data, that's where the ABC data comes from, is the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence. These are observational data where you literally sit and watch, or you ask someone to come and watch, or you have a little data sheet right there where you write down every time the child engages in that behavior, what happened right before, what happened right after. And then you should have sort of a running list. And then what I do first is I tend to focus on the consequences first and try and think about whether they were getting attention, or whether they were getting to escape, or whether they were getting access or getting out of something. And then I look at, well, what was the demand? What happened right before? Or is this happening? I look at the times. Is this happening every morning at arrival? Or is this happening every time we try to come in from recess? Is there a specific pattern? So one, looking at the consequence, and two, looking at time of day or data patterns. The only way to really get at the function and understand the meaning for repetitive, challenging behavior is to collect a lot of data and to go through it. It has to be really systematic to have an accurate hypothesis, which is hard in a school because there are limited resources and time and limited adults. But data collection usually is the first step. The other part of that is to try your best not to make an inference about the behavior. So like, he's just really frustrated, or this is really too hard. Try not to make that inference until you have data. So instead of saying, well, he's frustrated, what are you actually observing him do that's making you think that? So that's where I would start, is with the data. Right. So these are great, but there are the instances where there are other sort of neurobiological characteristics at play too that are beyond a child's control. So for example, like comparing ADHD and a language-based learning disability, children who truly have ADHD cannot control some of their hyperactivity or their impulses. It is not that many of them wish they could after the fact, but they cannot. So these are behavioral therapy approaches. Sometimes there are approaches that should be combined with behavioral therapy. And that's needs to be on a case-by-case basis about really how to proceed, knowing the full picture. But this is a behavioral approach, and behavior by itself does not always have a fast or immediate outcome, and it may need to be supplemented with additional strategies. Going back to that big language is complex graph where we had cognition and also thinking about executive functioning, those skills really then come into play in thinking about behavior and language. So the question was, what are my recommendations for placement in terms of a public school, a special school, a self-contained classroom, an inclusion classroom with additional supports and resources for students who have identified learning differences? I can't answer that question because I would say it depends on the student. So I would say that it depends on where can a child be most successful in the least restrictive environment, to use the federal legislation term. So where can that student have the resources and support to learn what he or she needs to learn? I will say that I do think it's very valuable in thinking about to make sure that there are opportunities for social interactions, that social skills are also a really big part of that. So thinking about both social and academic, and social emotional learning and academic learning as you consider those questions are important questions to ask. But I can't make a singular recommendation because I would say I want to meet the needs of the individual child. So the question is getting at this really critical issue we have in the field about how do we efficiently and accurately assess and measure internalizing behaviors You can't see them. I mean, you can see how they're manifested, but you can't see the behavior itself. So I think having some observational notes about how your behavioral observations about a child wanting to engage or not wanting to engage, like seeming withdrawn or not withdrawn. So they're going to be inferences about their internal behavior. So observational notes is one way. Getting to a point where a child can really communicate their feelings is really a critical piece of this, which is one of the critical skills you want to be able to teach, so that hopefully they can begin over time to learn when they might be feeling anxious or nervous or stressed, to be able to talk to you about how they're feeling. The other is internalizing behaviors often then end up with a manifestation of some sort of somatic complaint. Their stomach hurts, their head hurts, and so thinking about, or they're not sleeping, or they're having trouble eating. So making sure that you think about all of that as part of a big picture is a good starting point. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed being with you tonight, and I'll be up here for a few more minutes if you need anything.